The wind carried the scent of ancient forests and the distant tolling of bells that never ceased their morning song. Elodie de Valancourt descended from the carriage into a world where shadows held more substance than light, where stone walls breathed with memories too old for human understanding. The silver necklace at her throat, her mother's final gift, caught the moonlight like a promise she could not yet comprehend. Behind iron gates that groaned like living things, the castle of Rosven waited, its narrow windows watching her approach with the hunger of something that had been alone too long. She did not know yet that she had come not as a governess, but as salvation for a soul that had forgotten how to die. Before we dive into this story, leave your comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're joining us from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The servants received her with silence that felt heavier than words. No smiles touched their weathered faces. No hands reached out in welcome. Only eyes that followed her movements, as if she carried winter itself in the folds of her gray traveling dress. The great hall stretched before her like a cathedral of shadows, its vaulted ceiling lost in darkness that seemed to press down with the weight of centuries. Candles flickered in wall sconces, their flames bending away from her as she passed, as though even fire recognized her as something foreign to this place of eternal twilight. Elodie de Valancourt, daughter of a name that had died with the Revolution and a war that history preferred to forget, stood in the center of it all and felt the castle's breath against her skin. The stones themselves seemed to whisper, not words, but something deeper, older, a language that bypassed the mind and spoke directly to the blood. Her fingers found the silver chain at her throat, the pendant warm against her collarbone, despite the chill that permeated every corner of this ancient place. "Madame will find her chambers prepared," said the housekeeper, a woman whose face bore the marks of decades spent in service to something beyond ordinary understanding. Her voice carried the careful neutrality of one who had learned that speaking too freely in these halls could summon attention better left undisturbed. "Dinner is served at the stroke of 9, though—" She hesitated, her pale eyes flickering toward the grand staircase that curved up into darkness. The master's habits are irregular. The master, even unspoken, his presence filled the castle like smoke from some eternal fire. The servants moved around his absence with practiced choreography, their footsteps muffled on worn stone floors. Their voices pitched low, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might wake something that should remain sleeping. They called him the Lord of Rosven, and when they spoke the name at all, it was with the reverence reserved for things that existed beyond the natural order: storms, earthquakes, death itself. Elodie's chamber was a study in faded grandeur. Tapestries depicting scenes of medieval hunts covered walls that had once been white, but now held the yellow tinge of age. A fire crackled in the massive hearth, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move with purpose rather than the random play of flame and air. The bed was canopied in deep burgundy velvet, its curtains heavy enough to block out the world entirely. From the tall windows, she could see the grounds stretching away into mist-shrouded forest. And beyond that, mountains that looked like sleeping giants against the star-drunk sky. She unpacked her few belongings with methodical precision, each familiar object a small anchor in this sea of strangeness. Her mother's prayer book, bound in cracked leather, the miniature portrait of her father in his uniform, painted before the world had gone mad with revolution and terror. A volume of poetry that had sustained her through the long years after the money ran out and the great houses of France closed their doors to the children of the executed nobility. It was while she was arranging these treasures on the writing desk that she first felt him watching her. The sensation crept up her spine like cold fingers, a presence so intense it seemed to shift the very air in the room. She turned toward the door, expecting to find one of the servants, but the corridor beyond stretched empty and silent. Yet the feeling persisted, eyes upon her, measuring, waiting, filled with a hunger she could not name. The dining hall that evening was a cavern of solitude. The long table could have seated 30, but only one place was set, the silver gleaming against white linen like stars against snow. She ate in silence, broken only by the tick of an ancient clock and the whisper of wind through the castle's bones. Shadows moved in the corners of her vision, but when she turned to look, she found only darkness pooling in alcoves and doorways. It was on the third night that she first saw him. She had been unable to sleep. Her dreams haunted by the sound of footsteps in empty corridors and voices speaking in languages she almost understood. Wrapping her shawl around her shoulders, she descended the stairs toward the library, drawn by some instinct she could not explain. The castle felt different in the deep hours, more alive, more aware, as if the daylight hours were merely a pretense it maintained for the sake of its human inhabitants. The library doors stood open, spilling warm light into the corridor, like honey. She approached slowly, her bare feet silent on the cold stone, and saw him there, among the towering shelves. He stood with his back to her, one pale hand resting on the spine of an ancient volume. His dark hair catching the candlelight like spilled ink. Even motionless, he commanded the space around him with an authority that seemed to bend reality to his will. She knew, without knowing how, that this was the Lord of Rosvin. When he turned, the movement was fluid as water, predatory as a hunting cat. His face was a study in contradictions, beautiful as a Renaissance sculpture, yet marked by a weariness that spoke of centuries rather than years. His skin held the translucent quality of fine porcelain, and his eyes were the color of winter storms, pale and sharp and filled with something that might have been memory or might have been pain. They looked at each other across the space that separated them, and Elodie felt the world tilt on its axis. There was recognition in his gaze, as if he had been expecting her, as if her arrival was the culmination of some long-lain plan, rather than the desperate flight from poverty that had brought her here. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with possibilities neither could name. "You should not wander these halls at night," he said, and his voice was like velvet over steel, carrying accents that belonged to no single century or country. "There are rooms in this castle where dawn has never broken, corners where the darkness has weight and substance." She should have been afraid. Every instinct bred into her by years of careful survival in a world that devoured the unwary should have sent her fleeing back to her chamber. Instead, she found herself stepping forward, drawn by something deeper than curiosity, stronger than caution. "Then perhaps you should not leave your library doors open," she replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "It seems an invitation to exactly the sort of wandering you warn against." Something that might have been amusement flickered across his features. "And what makes you think the invitation was not intentional?" The question hung in the air between them like incense, heavy with implications she was not yet ready to examine. They stood there in the golden pool of candlelight, while the castle breathed around them, its ancient stones settling with sounds like distant sighs. Finally, he moved aside, gesturing toward the shelves, with a grace that belonged more to the ballrooms of Versailles than to this remote fortress. "Since you are here," he said, "perhaps you would join me. I find myself in need of company this evening." It was not really a request, though it was phrased as one. Elodie recognized the tone of absolute authority wrapped in courtesy, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. Yet there was something else beneath the surface, a loneliness so profound it seemed to echo in the very stones around them. She moved deeper into the library, her eyes trailing over shelves that rose toward a ceiling lost in shadow. The books here were ancient, their leather bindings worn smooth by countless hands, their titles written in scripts that belonged to dead languages and forgotten kingdoms. The air smelled of parchment and time, of secrets preserved in ink and memory. "Do you read?" he asked, watching her with that unsettling intensity. "Poetry mostly, history when I can find it. My education was interrupted." She touched one of the volumes, feeling the weight of ages in its binding. The revolution was not kind to those who valued learning over survival. "No," he said quietly. "Revolutions rarely are." He moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the chill that seemed to emanate from his skin. "Yet here you are, still seeking knowledge, despite all that was taken from you. That suggests a strength most do not possess." There was approval in his voice, and something else, a recognition that made her pulse quicken, despite the cold that radiated from him. She turned to meet his gaze and found herself caught in those pale eyes, drowning in depths that seemed to hold the accumulated weight of years beyond counting. "What are you?" she whispered, the question escaping before she could stop it. His smile was sharp as winter moonlight. "I am many things, Elodie de Valancourt. But tonight, I am simply a man who has been alone too long, speaking with a woman who understands the burden of carrying a dead name." He knew her full name, knew her history, though she had given neither to anyone in this place. The knowledge should have terrified her, but instead it sent a thrill of something that might have been excitement racing through her veins. Here was mystery made manifest, danger clothed in beauty and ancient courtesy. They talked until dawn touched the windows, their conversation ranging across centuries of art and literature, philosophy and loss. He spoke of things that had happened long before her birth, as if he had witnessed them firsthand, described the courts of dead kings with the intimacy of personal memory. When she questioned him, he deflected with the skill of someone who had learned the art of evasion through long practice. As the first light of morning began to creep across the library floor, he stepped back into the shadows that pooled between the shelves. "You should return to your chambers," he said, though his voice carried reluctance. "The servants will be stirring soon, and they have opinions about those who keep unusual hours." She wanted to protest, to demand answers to the 100 questions that had bloomed in her mind during their hours of careful conversation. Instead, she nodded and moved toward the door, pausing only when his voice followed her into the corridor. "Elodie." The way he spoke her name made it sound like a prayer, like a promise. "Do not venture into the east wing after sunset. There are some doors that should remain closed, even to one as fearless as you." The warning followed her back to her chamber, where she lay sleepless as the castle awakened around her. Through her window, she could see the grounds spreading away toward the forest, mist rising from the earth like the breath of sleeping giants. Somewhere in the depths of the building, she could hear the servants beginning their daily routines. Their voices carefully modulated, their footsteps quick and quiet. In the days that followed, she began to learn the rhythms of Rosvin Castle. The servants rose before dawn and moved through their tasks with the efficiency of long practice, but always with that underlying tension that spoke of carefully suppressed fear. They avoided certain corridors, never ventured into the East Wing, and fell silent whenever footsteps echoed from the upper floors. The housekeeper, Madame Corvina, proved to be a repository of carefully guarded information. She had served the castle for 30 years, she said, and before her, her mother had held the same position. The family had always been particular about their privacy, their traditions. Some things were best left unquestioned. She explained with the air of one who had learned wisdom through bitter experience. The master keeps unusual hours, she said, as they reviewed the household accounts in her small office behind the kitchens. He requires little in the way of traditional comforts. You will find him different from other gentlemen of your acquaintance. Different how? Elodie asked, though she suspected she already knew more of the answer than Madame Corvina would ever reveal. The older woman's hands stilled on the ledger before her. He is a man of great learning, great refinement. But he has been alone for a very long time, mademoiselle. Solitude changes people, especially when it stretches across many years. There was weight in those words, layers of meaning that Elodie was only beginning to glimpse. She thought of his face in the candlelight, the way his eyes had held depths that spoke of decades or centuries of accumulated memory. She thought of the cold that emanated from his skin, the way shadows seemed to bend toward him rather than away. That evening, she found herself drawn once again to the library. The doors stood open as before, candlelight spilling into the corridor like a golden invitation. He was there waiting, as if their midnight conversations had become a ritual neither needed to acknowledge aloud. "You came back," he said, not turning from the window where he stood watching the moon rise over the forest. "Did you think I would not?" "I hoped you would not." His voice carried an edge of something that might have been regret. "And I hoped you would." Both desires war within me, creating a conflict I have not experienced in a very long time. She moved to stand beside him at the window, close enough to feel that strange chill that seemed to be his constant companion. Outside, the grounds lay silver under moonlight, beautiful and terrible as a fairy tale landscape. "Why did you warn me away from the East Wing?" He turned to look at her then, his pale eyes searching her face as if seeking something he had lost long ago. "Because some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Because some truths, once known, change everything that comes after." "And if I said I was not afraid of change?" His smile was sad as winter twilight. "Then I would say you have not yet learned what change can cost." But despite his warnings, despite the careful way the servants avoided certain topics and certain parts of the castle, Elodie found herself increasingly drawn into the mystery that surrounded the Lord of Rosven. Their nightly conversations in the library became the anchor around which her days revolved. He spoke of art and literature with the passion of someone who had watched them evolve across centuries, described historical events with the precision of a witness rather than a scholar. Slowly, carefully, she began to piece together the truth that everyone else in the castle already knew, but dared not speak aloud. The Lord of Rosven was no ordinary man. He was something else, something that belonged to the realm of legend and nightmare, something that had walked the earth far longer than any mortal had the right to exist. Yet when she looked at him, really looked, past the supernatural beauty and the aura of otherworldly power, she saw something achingly human. Loneliness had carved lines around his eyes that no amount of immortal perfection could erase. He moved through his castle like a ghost, haunting his own life, surrounded by servants who feared him, and isolated by the very nature of what he had become. It was during their 5th midnight conversation that she finally gathered the courage, to ask the question that had been building in her mind since that first night in the library. "How long have you been alone?" He was silent for so long that she thought he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. "Longer than you have been alive, longer than your grandparents lived, long enough to forget what warmth feels like, what it means to touch another soul without the barrier of fear between you." The pain in his voice was so raw, so immediate, that she acted without thinking. Her hand moved to cover his where it rested on the arm of his chair, her warm fingers settling over his cold ones. The contact sent a shock through both of them, her warmth meeting his chill, her mortality pressing against his deathless existence. He stared down at their joined hands as if he had never seen such a thing before. "You should not touch me," he whispered, but he made no move to pull away. "Why? Will it hurt me?" "No." His fingers turned beneath hers, palm meeting palm. In that moment, Elodie understood that she had stumbled into something far more dangerous than any supernatural mystery. She was falling in love with a creature of shadow and legend, a being who existed outside the natural order of things. More terrifying still, she began to suspect that he was falling in love with her as well. The realization should have sent her fleeing. Instead, it anchored her more firmly to this strange place, to this impossible man who read poetry in dead languages and moved through his castle like a king in exile from his own life. But their growing closeness did not go unnoticed. The servants whispered among themselves when they thought she could not hear, their voices carrying undertones of fear and disapproval. In the village beyond the castle gates, rumors began to spread. Stories of the Frenchwoman who had come to serve as governess but remained as something else entirely, something that threatened the careful balance that had existed at Rosven for generations. It was Madame Corvina who finally confronted her, cornering her in the morning room where Elodie had been attempting to make sense of the household ledgers. "You play with forces you do not understand," the older woman said without preamble, her weathered hands twisted in her apron. "He is not a man like other men, and this attachment that grows between you will bring nothing but sorrow." "I don't know what you mean," Elodie replied, though the lie felt hollow even to her own ears. "You know exactly what I mean." Madame Corvina's voice carried the authority of someone who had served this house faithfully for decades, who had seen things that would shatter lesser minds. "He is ancient, mademoiselle, powerful beyond your comprehension. But he is also cursed, bound to this place by chains forged of blood and regret. Those who love him pay a price that no mortal should be asked to bear." The words hit like physical blows, each one finding its mark with surgical precision. But Elodie lifted her chin with the pride that had sustained her through the collapse of her family's fortune and the long years of genteel poverty that followed. "And what would you have me do? Flee in the night like a coward? Pretend that what exists between us is nothing more than the fancy of a lonely woman?" "I would have you live," Madame Corvina said simply. "I would have you return to the world of the living before it is too late to choose any other path." But it was already too late. Had been too late from the moment she first saw him, standing among the ancient books like a figure stepped out of a Gothic romance. Each night brought them closer together, their conversations growing more intimate, more dangerous. He began to share fragments of his history, carefully chosen pieces of a story that stretched back centuries, each revelation making him more real and more impossible at the same time. He had been a knight once, he told her, in an age when such things mattered. He had served kings whose names were now legend, had fought in battles that historians debated, but could never truly understand. The transformation had come as punishment for a sin he would not name. A curse that had stolen his mortality, but left his capacity for suffering intact. "Do you regret it?" she asked one night, as they sat before the library fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls around them. "I regretted it for the first century," he said, his pale eyes reflecting the firelight like mirrors. "For the second, I raged against it. By the third, I had learned to accept it as the natural order of my existence. But you?" He turned to look at her, and she saw something vulnerable in his expression, something that made her breath catch. "You make me remember what it felt like to be human." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither dared to cross. She wanted to reach for him, to offer whatever comfort her mortal warmth could provide. But something in his posture warned her away. He was holding himself in careful check, she realized, fighting against impulses that could destroy them both. "What happens now?" she whispered. "Now we continue as we have been," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We talk, we read together. We pretend that this can continue indefinitely without consequence." But pretense became increasingly difficult as the weeks passed. The villagers had grown suspicious of the Frenchwoman who never left the castle grounds, who was seen walking in the gardens at all hours as if she belonged there. Rumors began to reach them, whispers of unholy alliances, of ancient curses being awakened by foreign influence. It was during the first snow of winter that everything changed. Elodie had been walking in the garden, enjoying the way the white flakes caught in her dark hair, when she heard the sound of approaching horses. A delegation from the village had come, led by the local priest and several of the more prominent citizens. Their faces were set with the kind of determination that comes from righteous fear, and they carried torches despite the early hour. She watched from behind the winter-bare rose bushes as they confronted Madame Corvina at the castle's main entrance. Their voices carried clearly in the cold air, accusations and demands blending into a chorus of superstitious terror. They wanted the Frenchwoman gone, they said. Her presence had disturbed the natural order, awakened things that should have remained sleeping. "She cavorts with the devil himself," the priest declared, his voice ringing with holy authority. "The very stones of this place reek of unholy alliance. Send her away, or we will take measures to protect ourselves and our families." Madame Corvina's response was lost in the wind, but her posture spoke volumes. She was afraid, not of the villagers, but of what their ultimatum might force her master to do. Elodie had seen enough. She stepped out from behind the bushes, her chin raised in defiance despite the ice that had formed around her heart. "I am here," she called out, her voice carrying across the courtyard with bell-like clarity. "If you have accusations to make them to my face." The priest turned toward her, his eyes blazing with fanatic conviction. "Daughter of perdition," he intoned, raising his cross like a weapon. "You have brought corruption to this place, awakened appetites that God himself has condemned. Confess your sins and depart, or face the consequences of your unholy alliance." Before she could respond, the air itself seemed to change. The temperature dropped several degrees, and shadows began to gather despite the bright snow falling from the gray sky. The villagers huddled closer together, their torches flickering as if some unseen wind sought to extinguish them. He emerged from the castle like a force of nature made manifest. The Lord of Rosven descended the stone steps with fluid grace, his pale skin stark against his black clothing, his presence commanding the attention of every soul in the courtyard. The villagers fell back instinctively, their earlier bravado crumbling in the face of something that belonged more to nightmare than to the waking world. "You dare to come to my home?" he said, his voice carrying clearly, despite its soft tone, and threaten one who rests under my protection? The priest lifted his cross higher, his hand trembling slightly. We know what you are, creature of darkness. We know the unholy covenant that binds you to this place. But we will not allow you to corrupt an innocent soul with your foul appetites. Something that might have been amusement flickered across the Lord of Rosvin's features. Innocent? His pale gaze found Elodie across the courtyard, and she felt the weight of centuries in his look. Tell me, holy man, what do you know of innocence? What do you know of corruption? He began to move toward the priest, each step measured and predatory. The villagers pressed back against each other, their fear a palpable thing in the winter air. But it was not fear for themselves that drove them, Elodie realized. It was fear for her. Fear of what they believed her association with him had cost her soul. She came to us freely, the Lord of Rosvin continued, his voice carrying an edge that made the very stones seem to listen. She remains freely. No power compels her but her own choice. Choice? The priest's voice cracked with emotion. What choice can a mortal woman have against the wiles of the damned? You have bewitched her, stolen her will as surely as you have stolen her virtue. The accusation hung in the air like a blade, sharp and cutting. Elodie felt something break inside her chest. Not her heart, but something deeper. Something that had to do with dignity and truth, and the right to choose her own path, regardless of the consequences. Enough, she said, stepping forward into the space between the two forces. Her voice was quiet, but it carried clearly in the winter stillness. I am not bewitched. I am not compelled. I am here because I choose to be here, because I have found in this place and with this man something that the world of ordinary ordals could never offer me. She turned to face the priest directly, meeting his horrified gaze with steady eyes. You speak of corruption, Father, but what do you know of it? I have lived in your world of conventional morality, where women are chattel to be traded between men, where love is secondary to social position and financial advantage. If choosing something different, something real, makes me corrupt in your eyes, then I accept that judgment gladly. The priest recoiled as if she had struck him. Child, you know not what you say. The creature has addled your wits, stolen your very soul. Come away with us now, and we will help you find redemption through prayer and penance. And if I refuse? The man's face hardened. Then we will take measures to ensure that your corruption spreads no further. There are authorities who deal with such things. Ways to cleanse a community of unholy influence. The threat was clear, and Elodie felt the Lord of Rosvin tense beside her. She could sense the predator in him rising to the surface, could feel the dangerous energy that radiated from his perfectly still form. In that moment, she understood that the choice before them was not simply about her reputation or even her safety. It was about whether love could survive in a world that insisted on defining it according to narrow, fearful rules. She looked at the man who had become the center of her world, this creature of shadow and legend, who had taught her that loneliness was not the natural state of existence, that even the damned could find redemption in the touch of understanding hands. His pale eyes met hers, and in them she saw a question that had no easy answer. What was she willing to sacrifice for love? What price would she pay to stand beside someone who existed outside the natural order of things? The answer came to her with the clarity of winter starlight. She reached for the silver chain at her throat, her mother's final gift, and lifted it over her head. The pendant caught the gray light as she held it out, its surface reflecting the faces of everyone in the courtyard, villagers and servants, priest and lord. all of them watching as she made her choice. "This was my mother's," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "The last link to a world that no longer exists, to a life that was taken from me by forces beyond my control. I have carried it as a reminder of what I lost, what I could never reclaim." She let the chain slide through her fingers, the pendant falling to the snow-covered stones with a sound like a bell tolling. "But I am tired of carrying the past like a chain around my neck. I am tired of letting other people's fears dictate the shape of my life." She turned to face the Lord of Rosvan, this impossible man who had shown her that love could exist even in the darkest places, even between a mortal woman and a creature of legend. "If you will have me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying all the courage she possessed, "then I choose to stay. Not as your governess, not as your guest, but as whatever you will allow me to be." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as they looked at each other across the space that separated them. Then, slowly, he smiled. Not the sharp, predatory expression she had seen him wear before, but something gentle, something that transformed his entire face. "Then stay," he said simply. "Stay and be whatever your heart tells you to be." The priest let out a cry of dismay, his voice breaking with horror and disappointment. "Damned soul! You have chosen eternal perdition over earthly salvation." But Elodie no longer heard his words. She was walking toward the man who had become her destiny, her hand extended, her heart finally free of the fears that had governed it for so long. When their fingers touched, she felt warmth flood through her despite the winter cold, felt the lonely places in her soul fill with something that might have been hope. The villagers departed in defeat, their torches smoking in the gray air, their voices raised in prayers for the lost soul who had chosen damnation over redemption. The servants scattered to their duties, their faces carefully neutral, their loyalty to their master outweighing their fear of supernatural consequence. But Elodie and the Lord of Rosvan remained in the courtyard as the snow continued to fall around them. Their hands joined, their fates finally intertwined beyond the power of any earthly authority to separate. "What happens now?" she asked. The same question she had posed weeks earlier, but with entirely different implications. "Now we discover what it means to love without reservation," he replied, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "Now we learn whether two souls can find peace together, even when one of them has forgotten what peace feels like." That night, for the first time since her arrival at Rosvan Castle, Elodie did not return to her own chamber when the library conversations ended. Instead, she remained with him as the fire burned low and the shadows deepened, talking in whispers about futures they had never dared to imagine and pasts that had shaped them into people capable of this impossible love. When dawn finally touched the windows, painting the world in shades of pearl and rose, she understood that she had found what she had been searching for without knowing it. A place where she belonged completely, without reservation or condition. The silver necklace lay forgotten in the courtyard snow, already covered by fresh flakes that would hide it until spring came to uncover the remnants of the life she had chosen to leave behind. The seasons that followed were unlike anything either of them had experienced. The servants, initially fearful of the changes that love had brought to their ancient domain, gradually came to accept the new order of things. Madame Corvina, practical above all else, simply adapted the household routines to accommodate a mistress who kept unusual hours and had unusual needs. The villagers denied their opportunity for dramatic intervention, eventually found other sources of gossip and moral outrage. Occasionally, travelers would bring news of the strange Frenchwoman who had disappeared into the cursed castle on the moor. But the stories grew less frequent as time passed, and no dire consequences manifested in the surrounding countryside. For Elodie, the months brought a kind of peace she had never known existed. She learned to navigate the peculiar rhythms of life with a creature who existed outside normal time, who slept during the day and came alive with the darkness. She discovered that love, when freely given and received, could transform even the most unlikely circumstances into something beautiful. The Lord of Rosvin, for his part, seemed to grow more human with each passing day. Color returned to his pale cheeks, warmth to his touch. The servants whispered that love was working a miracle, that their master was somehow becoming mortal again through the power of his attachment to the French woman. But Elodie knew better. He was not becoming human. She was becoming something else, something that could exist in the space between mortality and eternity. She could feel the change in herself, subtle but undeniable. Her reflection in mirrors grew fainter. Her appetite for ordinary food diminished. Her awareness of the supernatural currents that flowed through the castle grew stronger. She was not afraid. If this was the price of love, she paid it gladly, each small transformation bringing her closer to the man who had become her entire world. They had found something rare and precious in each other, something that transcended the ordinary boundaries of mortal existence. One night, as winter began to give way to spring, he asked her the question she had been expecting since the day she chose to stay. "Do you regret it? The life you gave up? The world you left behind?" She considered the question seriously, looking back over the months that had passed since she first stepped down from the carriage into this realm of shadows and secrets. She thought of the ordinary life she might have lived. Marriage to someone like Lord Whitmore, children who would have carried forward a name that meant nothing, years of careful respectability in a world that had no place for the dreams that lived in her heart. "I regret nothing," she said finally, her hand finding his in the darkness. "I have found more life in these months with you than I found in all the years that came before. If this is darkness, then let the whole world remain in light. I choose this twilight realm where love exists without boundaries." He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm that seemed to seal some unspoken covenant between them. "Then we will make our own world," he said. "A place where creatures like us can exist without apology, where love is stronger than fear, where the damned can find redemption in each other's arms." The castle around them seemed to sigh in response, its ancient stone settling into new patterns that could accommodate this unprecedented union. Outside, the moors stretched away under starlight, beautiful and terrible and eternal. Inside, two souls who had found each other against impossible odds continued their quiet revolution against the world's definitions of what love could and could not be. And if sometimes, in the deep hours before dawn, the sound of their laughter echoed through corridors that had known only silence for centuries, who was to say that such joy was anything less than miraculous? Who was to judge the love that bloomed between a mortal woman and a creature of legend, when that love had the power to bring light to the darkest places and hope to the most desolate hearts? In the end, perhaps that was the only truth that mattered. Not what they were, but what they had become together. Not the world they had left behind, but the world they were creating, one quiet evening at a time, in the space between sunset and dawn, where all things impossible became possible, and love conquered even death itself. If this story found a mirror in your soul, leave your comment and share. Sometimes what hurts in us is what makes us most human.